Story 1. When I was in 5th grade, I fell out of a tree and bumped my head pretty badly. I woke up 3 days later in the hospital. For me, the experience is easily summarized in 3 parts. 1. When I fell, I blacked out before I hit the ground, or at least that is where my memory fades. The word fades is the best description. It was as if my consciousness drained away into blackness and nothingness. My body seemed to shut down to avoid the pain. 2. I have very vague memories while in the coma of hearing my dad reading a book, my mom telling me she knew I would pull through, or of a tube in my nose. These were always fuzzy moments and I was never fully conscious during them. It felt like a half-second of awareness of one particular thing, the way the tube felt taped against my arm and wishing I could reach out and move it, and then back into nothingness. I think I was a little more aware each time this happened, but I am not certain. 3. Waking up was very sudden. I was in blackness, had a moment of awareness that my neck hurt, and then the pain became much worse. No longer a distant perception, it was something I was actively conscious of. Waking up was the most painful moment of my life. I started crying and then could not even cry because it hurt so much. I think this had more to do with injuries to my neck and head than the coma. After an hour, my body adjusted to the pain and I felt normal, although very weak, hungry, and thirsty. I survived and am fine now without any lasting issues. Story 2. In 2016, I was in a coma from March 31st to May 5th, then half awake for another month. It was the longest, scariest dream of my life. I was medically induced with a fentanyl drip for about a week at first. Fentanyl was horrible and I had wacky dreams about fighting corrupt hospital officials, so my brain knew where I was. They did not think I would ever talk or walk again. But in the hospital bed, I laughed at an episode of that 70s show and improved every day after. That puts me at about 85% health overall these days. I am pretty much an average guy. It was a head injury. I had a seizure in the bathroom and fell onto the sink. Story 3. I had meningitis when I was 12, which was misdiagnosed as the stomach flu, and I was taken to the hospital at the last minute. My last memory before losing consciousness was drifting off while watching emergency news about the Brussels airport attack. I later had a fever dream that turned out to reflect reality. My parents driving me to the emergency room and saying, "It's okay," repeatedly. I couldn't move or talk, so it felt more like a dream than something happening. I saw the lights of the emergency room parking lot, closed my eyes, and then it was like taking a nap. I had no awareness of time. It was like going to sleep and waking up a second later, but it was already morning. I woke up 6 days later, heavily sedated, and only gained full consciousness the day after. My first memory after waking is opening my laptop in the hospital bed to play Minecraft. I have no idea what happened or what I said when I woke up before that. Story 4. I can only compare it to waking up at a friend's house as a child and not knowing where you are. I was in a coma for 2 months after a bad car accident. It was not medically induced. It was caused by brain damage. When I woke up, I was alone in a hospital room and had no idea what had happened or why I was there. I was wearing a neck brace because I had broken my neck, so I assumed something was wrong with my neck but did not know how it had happened. For some reason, I thought I was 60 years old. I was actually in my 20s. I was paranoid and scared and used context clues to realize I was in a hospital. It was frightening. After about 5 minutes, I decided to go back to sleep. 2 months of sleep was not quite long enough. Story 5. I was sedated for 2 weeks because of swine flu. During that time, Oprah announced she was ending the Oprah Winfrey Show. I was very upset to learn this after the fact. Mostly because the television in my room and the drugs they gave me to keep me under produced the most cinematic dreams I have ever experienced. Somehow the news of Oprah retiring filtered into my brain as a dream about saving the whales with her in a submerged Chicago. We had a champagne brunch. It was excellent. I was also a superhero who could fly and fought my enemies on the rims of volcanoes. Then I woke up, and not only could I not fly, but my friend Oprah had betrayed me into retirement. I was crushed. Story 6. I was hit by a truck and was in a coma for 4 days. Felt like a power nap in the hospital. Update. When I woke up, I was worried because I had no idea where I was or why. Story 7. I was not in a coma for long, just under a week. While I was in the coma, I did not remember anything. When I came out of it, I remembered hearing my mom shout to the attending physician, "He is up!" I woke up with several people in white coats in the room. I was very stiff and confused. Oddly, I continued to have vivid dreams of myself in the coma. I still have them to this day. They are almost like an out-of-body experience because I can see myself lying in the bed with people around me. Story 8. This is so interesting to read about everyone's experience. I am an intensive care unit nurse and I work with patients in comas all the time. I talk to them and explain why I am touching them, whether to give medication, draw blood for laboratory tests, bathe them, or clean them after an incontinent episode. I reorient them to where they are, why they are there, and how their situation occurred. I tell them when their loved ones call to check on them. I would feel awful knowing that someone I cared for had flashbacks of feeling violated during a coma. Story 9. I was in a medically induced coma for about a week. The coma itself is not much to talk about. There is a gap in my memory, even from before it happened. I do not even remember the accident that brought me there. Waking up was a much different story. Because I had been given large doses of painkillers and sedatives, I was essentially high as a kite. Because the trauma I had suffered was severe, my brain constructed stressful, vivid nightmares that I remember to this day. Story 10. I was in a medically induced coma for 3 days following a serious cycling accident. I woke with no recollection of why I was there or of what was said while I was unconscious. It was easily the scariest situation I have experienced, but I do not remember it. I woke to my mother and father beside me in the hospital, and my body was in traction. That was far more frightening to me. Story 11. I was in a short coma of 6 days after a brain hemorrhage. I recall nothing during the coma. I have a fuzzy understanding of my first week or two after waking, pieced together from the stories I was told. Memories of the day or days leading up to it were temporarily wiped out but have since returned. This was more than a decade ago, so take this with a grain of salt. My memory is imperfect. My coma was induced so doctors could stabilize me and drain the blood from my skull. Story 12. I was hit by a car when I was 5 years old. I developed toxic shock syndrome and went into a coma for 4 months. I only remember some very strange dreams, which I can still recall vividly 26 years later. Someone mentioned visiting another realm, and that is close to the mark. Story 13. Not me, but my dad described his coma after his car accident. He was pulled up a little too far at a stop sign when a driver who was speeding and using his phone swerved off the road. He was in a coma for about 2 months. From my perspective, it wasn't like the movies. He didn't just wake up miraculously. It was 2 months of steady improvements. One eye opened, then a few days later his other eye was half open. Then he could wiggle a toe, then he could move his fingers, and gradually more movement followed. He said he could hear bits and pieces of what was happening around him, but it was like a dream he couldn't wake up from. When my 2 younger siblings and I came in and talked to him, his heart rate would decrease. When a football game was on and his friends sat with him to watch, the nurses made them turn it off once his team started losing because his heart rate increased. He is a fan of the Miami Dolphins, so I guess his heart rate never fully returned to normal. I have never received an award before. Thanks for the awards and the stories, everyone. Story 14. I had a motorcycle wreck a few years ago. Someone who was texting blew a stop sign, and I ended up T-boning them. I'm not sure if coma is the correct term, but I was unconscious for 2 days. Felt like the worst, least refreshing nap in history. I had the wreck on a Sunday, woke up sometime Tuesday afternoon or evening, and asked if the bike was okay. It was not. Story 15. My wife was in a diabetic coma for 2 weeks when she was in elementary school. She knew her blood sugar was low, and then suddenly she woke up in the hospital with no idea that any time had passed. Edit. I am just going to add this since this is getting a lot of attention. She loved a video. Story 16. I was in that state for 2 weeks. I would not wish it on anyone. Felt like a long dream. I realized I had been asleep for a long time. I could still feel and hear, and those sensations were incorporated into my dream. My hands were restrained to prevent me from pulling out tubes, and in my dream I felt as if I were being held in a prison. Story 17. I was in a medically induced coma for 3 days during my cancer treatment. My identical twin brother died about a year earlier, also from cancer, and the entire time I was in the coma I was with him. We were in a large green field with a lot of sunlight, and my conversations with him felt real. Other than that, I did not hear any of my family talking to me while I was asleep. It was as if I had gone to bed for 3 days and then woke up feeling very tired. I wonder whether my interactions with my twin brother were real or if they were just caused by the drugs I had been given. Story 18. I don't remember 10 days. I'm not sure if it's a blessing or a curse. I was hit by a drunk driver. My wife and I survived. Our daughter did not. To me, the stuff on television where the patient wakes up and everything goes back to normal is nonsense. When I woke up, I was in a conversation with another patient. The Air Force had sick bays, not individual rooms. I can only compare it to a computer. I had been stuck in an update and then, flicker, a new screen. I had woken up several days earlier, but nothing stayed with me. My wife says I was paranoid that they were putting acid in my intravenous line because I felt like I was tripping. I was hostile and aggressive. I read the medical records. They kept me restrained for a couple of days after I hit a nurse. I started acting normal, so they moved me from the intensive care unit to the sick bay. The blessing is forgetting 10 days of some pretty intense pain. I was broken in many places and bruised in all the rest. I never knew you could bruise some of those places. That freaked me out. The curse was that I was not there when my wife needed me most. There is a tinge of guilt that she faced that grief alone for 10 days. I know it could not be helped. It was not my fault, but try living through it and tell me how it feels. Story 19. There was a boy named Martin Pistorius who fell into a coma for 12 years. His mind became aware about 2 years in, but he could not speak or move, and many people believed he was unresponsive. For more than a decade, he was mistreated in care facilities where the same children's program played on repeat, and he also endured physical and sexual abuse. At one point, he could not stop vomiting and was tube-fed. His parents were unaware of these abuses and tried to cope. In one of his lowest moments, he remembers his mother saying she wished he would die, and he felt compassion for her instead. Eventually, someone noticed he could respond and arranged the help he needed. He now has a wife and children, communicates with a voice synthesizer, and works as a computer programmer. He recovered from cryptococcal meningitis, a fungal infection of the brain and spinal cord caused by inhaling fungus from soil contaminated with bird droppings. He gave a technology, entertainment, design talk online. Story 20. I had a dirt bike accident during the summer between 8th grade and 9th grade. I do not remember much about the day or two before. I have flashbacks like a dream. I woke up in the hospital a day or so later. To me, it was like waking from sleep. I did have some memory loss that lasted a couple of hours. This memory loss was different from simply not remembering the day or so before. When I woke up, although I recognized my parents, I did not remember the previous few years of school, such as graduating from 8th grade. I had a full panic attack. I thought I was going to have to repeat a couple of grades and that I had become mentally handicapped. This was in the 1980s, so I did not use that exact term. Everything did come back, but that hour after waking up still haunts me. Story 21. Not me, but my dad. He was in a coma for about a week after riding his bike headfirst into a telephone pole. He said he remembered the accident itself, followed by an out-of-body experience. He remembered flying high above the scene and looking down at his body lying there, lifeless. He remembered a woman from the neighborhood rushing over and other neighbors bringing out a flat beach chair to put him on while waiting for the ambulance. When he woke from the coma, he immediately broke down crying as a flood of stimulation and confusion hit him. His brain was about 5 or 6 years behind. He remembered his phone number and address from years earlier but could not recall his current information. It took about 2 weeks for his brain to catch up to the present. The spookiest part. He went to the house of the woman he had seen first from above and asked whether she had been the first to get there and about other details he had seen. She confirmed everything. Story 22. A kid I went to middle school with spent 5 months in a medically induced coma while waiting for a new heart. In dream time, it felt like several years. He could fly and was stronger, but he also had to fight clowns with chainsaws. He was aware he was in a coma but could not do anything about it. At one point in the dream, he was tasked with doing something that seemed impossible, yet he somehow did it. In the real world, medical professionals at one point said recovery was impossible. I am not sure what health complications were occurring then, or whether this was before or after the transplant. Story 23. I was placed in a medically induced coma after a car accident in which the driver fell asleep at the wheel, swerved off the road, and my car flipped over 3 times. I suffered a brain bleed and traumatic brain injury and underwent surgery in which a piece of my skull was removed to relieve pressure. I was sedated for 3 weeks and remember having a vivid 2-week dream made up of a variety of bizarre scenarios. 1. I was a box of ginger ale in a race against a box of Dr. Pepper in a supermarket. We were each on shopping carts and I barely beat Dr. Pepper. After that, I wanted ginger ale for weeks. 2. Something involving a bunch of ninjas, a boat, and an assassination that was going to occur. 3. I was a fish stuck in an enclosure that I had to escape. 4. I was in a turf war with my fraternity friends against a rival fraternity and we both had battleships. Gravy and mashed potatoes were involved somehow. 5. I was trying to escape the hospital but was too weak to walk and could not get out of my bed. When I woke up 3 weeks later, I was confused and had to piece together what happened from what the doctors and visitors told me. I would laugh very easily at random phrases from friends who visited. I underwent 3 months of rehabilitation to relearn how to walk and talk. Doctor said my recovery was relatively fast, but I still have impaired concentration and low energy, and I was prescribed Adderall for that issue. Story 24. I was hit by a direct bolt of lightning when I was 12. I was playing catch with my best friend in a light drizzle. The next thing I remember, I was in an ambulance. Then 6 days had passed. Apparently, you can have many small heart attacks or stoppages when you are hit by a bolt like that, even hours or days later until your heart muscles resynchronize, and a defibrillator is not guaranteed to fix it. I remember nothing, not even the sensation of falling asleep. It was like that episode of Futurama with the Harlem Globetrotters and the time skips. I was playing catch with Steven, and in an instant I was in the ambulance with a large man looming over me, and then I was sitting up in a strange bed with lots of plastic on me. Fun fact, I was hit indirectly under a tree by another bolt some years later. Although I did not lose consciousness, I spent a week as a nervous wreck, convinced my heart was going to stop randomly. Story 25. I was in a coma because I fell 15 meters and broke nearly all the bones in my back. It was horrible. When I woke up, I thought the nurses were torturing me and that I needed to escape. I started hallucinating a lot and could not even understand that I was in a hospital. The biggest problem was my dreams. I thought I was a time traveler or some kind of god. I thought I had been shot by the police and experienced other terrifying events. I still have flashbacks to this day, and it is no fun. I am getting therapy to deal with it. I could even watch pornography in my dreams. It was confusing and horrible at the same time. 0 out of 10. I would not do it again. Story 26. This is not my story, but in a previous post asking this question, there was a man who described having a whole second life while in a coma. He described vivid memories of his family and friends. He met a woman and they had children together. One day he was sitting in his lounge and began staring at a lamp. There was something off about it, but he could not tell what. He stared and kept staring throughout the night. Then he realized the lamp was not real. Suddenly he began recalling his real life and woke from his coma. He said that to this day he still grieves the loss of the family he experienced during the coma. He said he sometimes sees the children from that coma life in his dreams. It was really interesting and depressing. If anyone can find that comment, let me know. Edit. I am grateful that Reddit users seem to have the uncanny ability to dig up comments that are over 8 years old. It turns out in this instance it was not a coma. The man had simply been unconscious for a few minutes. Still a crazy story. To everyone reading it for the first time, I apologize for your collective existential crisis. Story 27. It was very peaceful, like a long nap with occasional hallucinations. They used medications to keep me comatose for healing purposes. It did not get bad until they reduced the sedation. I did not know where I was, and I had the worst, most vivid hallucinations. I hallucinated that my mother was trying to remove me from the ventilator, that I was being chased by a murderer, that the room was on fire, that the nurse was trying to kill me, and my personal favorite, a robot that floated around like a drone dispensing free weed to everyone. I was extremely vocal, yelling after my breathing tube was removed about what I called the weed bot and how great it smelled. It turned out to be a lamp that bends like the lamp at the dentist. I have no memory at all of the day before I ended up in a coma, which worries me because I used to have a good memory. You do not wake up and return to normal. Recovery takes intense work, and I am still not fully recovered. Relearning to stand was incredibly painful, and learning to walk again was painful too. There was a loss of dignity that embarrassed me at the time. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder a few months after this event. The beeping of machines in medical shows sends my mind right back to the intensive care unit. Going through occasional procedures terrifies me, because during my time in the intensive care unit, so many people touched my body without explanation or my consent. I understand they had to do their job and I could not consent while comatose, but similar things happened when I was awake. I experienced a decline in memory and my hair fell out for months afterwards. On July 4th, it will be 3 years. I went into a coma on the 5th anniversary of my grandmother's death in 2017. Edit. The most interesting, quirky thing I nearly forgot was that although I was too sedated to open my eyes and comprehend what nurses and doctors were saying, a combination of sedation and auditory hallucinations, I could still hear their words in the machines beeping. It felt like a deep nap where you can hear everything in your environment. Because of paralytic medications, I could not move or open my eyes when they touched me. Imagine being stripped and given a sponge bath when you cannot speak, move, or see. It felt violating, although I understand it was their job. When they reduced the sedation considerably, I was able to open my eyes, but they had a hard time weaning sedation because I had the breathing tube and kept trying to talk. No one could understand me with the tube in my throat, so I began to scream the words as loud as I could. Nurses try to avoid that because a patient on a ventilator is already at risk for vocal cord damage due to the tube. A nurse brought a piece of paper with the alphabet on it, so I could point to each letter to spell out what I wanted to say. I remember being so thirsty that I begged for water even with a tube in my throat. After hearing them mention a magnetic resonance imaging scan, I frantically tried to spell no contrast because they did not know about my allergy. I was not allowed to drink even after the tube was removed because they feared aspiration. When I finally got to drink my first drink, a tiny cup of cola filled halfway, I was so excited my heart rate rose so much that a team of nurses came in. I wanted to share this to help others understand. I have never had the chance to speak about my experience and my family does not talk about it, but we are able to joke about the weed bot hallucinations. Story 28. This will probably get buried, but I'll share my experience. I went to the hospital with renal failure and an oxygen saturation of 32%. I remember the nurse saying my urine looked like root beer, and when she stuck my arm to insert an intravenous line, she only said, oh. My arm got very warm, and my dad moved my head, so I would not see how much blood was coming out. The next thing I knew, I was in a hospital bed tearing through the desert at more than 60 miles per hour. Nothing but me and the bed, no motor, just cruising. I would see all sorts of strange things, most notably Ronald McDonald, whom I saw all the time. Then the hospital bed would come to a screeching halt and I would be in the living room of someone I knew. My grandma, good friends, former coaches, basically any living room where I had spent time with someone I cared about. The strange thing was the living rooms were always three-walled. One wall was missing, and beyond that wall was a barren desert. We would talk for a while about God knows what, then I would be pulled back into the desert at more than 60 miles per hour. It repeated many times. Sometimes the same living rooms reappeared, but most were unique. When I came out of the coma, everyone kept commenting on how good my hair looked. I couldn't figure out why, so I asked my mom how long I had been asleep. She said 13 days. I had cards and flowers from all the people whose living rooms I'd been visiting during my coma. It was surreal and I can't explain it, especially since most of the cards came from people who were not allowed to visit me in intensive care and were sending well wishes in writing rather than in person. Story 29. I work as a registered nurse in the intensive care unit. I mostly care for medical patients these days, but I also work in trauma, surgical, neurologic, and occasionally cardiac care. Most of my patients, especially now with coronavirus disease 2019, are under deep intravenous sedation. We use medications ranging from intravenous opioids to benzodiazepines, and sometimes ketamine or dexmedetomidine. Patients receiving ketamine often seem more present or confused. I cannot imagine the disorientation of being touched, cleaned, and exposed to bright lights while in a ketamine-induced dissociative state. Intensive care unit delirium is a real problem, and many people leave with intense post-traumatic stress disorder. Whenever I care for a sedated patient, I try to reorient them by telling them where they are, what day and time it is, and why they are in the hospital, even if I said it a short time earlier. I do not know if it helps, but it is what I would want for myself. Please wear a mask to reduce the risk of severe illness and the possibility of needing mechanical ventilation. The intensive care unit can be a frightening place with tubes, catheters, and repeated arterial punctures. Story 30. I had a traumatic brain injury when I was in my early 20s. I hit my head on concrete and was knocked out cold, or at least I thought I was. Friends called an ambulance. While it was on its way, they said I got up and asked what had happened. They told me to sit down, but I said I was fine and would walk home. I took 2 steps, became very confused, sat down, and vomited. I did not move until the ambulance arrived and took me in. The next thing I remember was being stitched up in the emergency room. I swore I saw my boss there and asked him what had happened, then passed out again. I woke up 2 days later in the hospital, recovering from a severe concussion. However, it turned out I had been awake and talking to visitors during that time. There were even pictures of me with people. I had no memory of the period around the accident beyond the earlier details. Story 31. My daughter was in a medically induced coma for 2 days after a drowning accident. She made a full recovery, but the things she told us about freaked me out. My wife, however, seemed to already know and accept it. Imagine having your 3-year-old tell you about playing Mermaid Tea Party with your dead parents. She described being denied entry to the gates of heaven because St. Patrick told her it was not her time. I know it is supposed to be St. Peter, but I wore a shirt that said St. Patrick is my homeboy, and she said excitedly that she had met him. The aftereffects have been extremely strange. Mentally, she is okay. Physically and emotionally, she is fine, but she sees ghosts. I could write a whole Reddit no-sleep series about what she sees and what she has said. The most recent incident was a few months ago after her uncle, my brother-in-law, passed away suddenly. Story 32. I have been in 2 medically induced comas. Both times it felt like a dreamless sleep. I was unaware of time passing. It was strange to wake up and be told it was Thursday when the last thing I remembered was Monday. I do not remember anyone talking to me, but my mother said she spoke to me every day and that the only time I would react was when she mentioned a certain name. She said that whenever she said his name, my eyes would flutter. Otherwise, there was no response. It is also very confusing for at least the first 30 minutes because the drugs are still wearing off. You are intubated, have a nasogastric tube for feeding, a central line for medications, and a urinary catheter. All of this is usually removed, which is unpleasant, while you are still trying to wake up and make sense of the situation. I would say it is not one of the top 10 experiences to have before you die. Story 33. I was in a medically induced coma for about a week. I was metabolizing the propofol very quickly. I can remember coming to. My hands were strapped to the bed and a ventilator tube was in my throat. I would panic and try to communicate with my hands to the voices I heard in the room. My entire family was in the room during one of those times. Waking up, I was so frustrated that I could not communicate that I ended up flipping them all off with both hands as the nurse administered more medication, and I passed out again. My family was relieved that I was still in there and laughed. When I finally came out of the coma, it took me a few days to learn to use my legs again. I had the craziest, most vivid hallucinations, and my sense of what was real and what was a hallucination is still fuzzy. I know the totem pole of people smoking a cigar and blowing all of their collective smoke through the hole in the roof was not real. That is so crazy it is obvious. But I do not know whether all the nurses' conversations with family members were real. I still question my memories to this day, and it has been about 8 years. Opiates are a fucking dangerous drug. Kids, be careful and do your research on harm reduction. I would not wish an overdose on anyone. Story 34. My best friend was in a medically induced coma for 2 weeks. He believes he fought the devil in the depths of hell and then spoke with God on a mountain. He says God told him he could never be that weak again. He also thought he had been granted a wish and had gone on an elk hunt. When he woke up, he asked his wife when his elk would be returned from the taxidermist. Story 35. I have a close friend who was in a medically induced coma. It is not my place to say, but his experience was terrible. Vivid nightmares and horrific dreams that he cannot separate from reality today. If you have to have difficult conversations about him, do not do it in the room with him. He could hear everything. Story 36. It was not a coma, but I will classify this as unintentionally sleeping in odd places. I blacked out for quite a while due to heat stroke. Apparently, I was passed out on the ground. I woke up with a warm, tingling sensation and honestly thought I was in bed. Instead, I was in the middle of a shopping center with my brother standing over me, laughing. Story 37. It was odd and very interesting. I think you will like this. It may be unique. I was playing a lot of Halo 4 at the time, and I had an Android Galaxy Live wallpaper. When I was knocked out for over a month, I saw that Galaxy spinning around as if it were a Halo 4 loading screen. What is really strange is I remember an odd message at the bottom right of the screen that said, "Do not turn off your Xbox 360 console." It was there too. It was kind of weird and cool. I was in that state of mind for about 30 seconds, and then I woke up. Story 38. In July 2018, I was in a severe car accident. My spine and hip were fractured in 11 places, and I had some damage to my spleen, which has healed. Before surgery, I was not worried. I was told the surgery would last 6 to 7 hours. The neurosurgeon tried to approach through my ribs. She sawed a rib in half, but when she reached my spine, she discovered the damage was far worse than what appeared on the x-rays, and she could not continue through my ribs. So they closed me and re-prepared the operating room. She then made an incision in my back about a foot long, and the orthopedic surgeon fixed my hip. In total, I believe the procedures took around 14 hours. Being under anesthesia for so long, and with severe swelling, they had to keep me sedated for about 5 days. I remember nothing from the month prior to my accident except the accident itself. Waking up in the intensive care unit, I remember the breathing tube being removed and waking up holding my dad's hand. My family was not allowed in all at once the first day. They were permitted one by one in case I coded and staff had to clear the room quickly. Each of them went in for about 30 minutes, held my hand, and cried. I remember being asked questions like what day it was. I was confused when I said July 7th and the doctor said close enough. The doctor giggled when I groaned at the question of who the current president of the United States is. Waking up felt extremely loopy and exhausted. Because I had a breathing tube in for days, my tongue was completely numb, covered in red sores, and very painful. The week after waking was confusing. I would open my eyes and close them. What felt like a minute had actually been 2 days. During the coma, there is a total feeling of nothing. I was told I would hold my dad's hand or even look up at my family and smile, which apparently is possible when you are in a coma. I still had moments of complete confusion after waking, which is common. I would feel disoriented and call for a nurse who would calm me down. It took about 2 weeks to regain any feeling in my tongue. I also had no feeling in my chest or arms. I could move my hands but not really feel anything. I regained most of the feeling, but I never recovered feeling in my armpits for some reason. According to the neurologist, it is a miraculous outcome that I am alive and able to walk. Story 39. My brother was in a coma for 2 days. He says he remembers everything before and after the coma. His first word when he woke up was chicken. He was 9 when it happened. Story 40. When I was 17, I fell into a natural coma for 4 days from a sudden case of viral encephalitis. I spent 2 nights in the intensive care unit with a ventilator and a feeding tube. The weirdest thing is how the pieces come back after a while. I remember the morning it happened. I woke up knowing something was wrong, stumbled into my parents' room, tried to scream but was slowly becoming paralyzed. My vision was the first to go, then my balance. I couldn't form coherent words, and then I lost consciousness as if I had been given a slow dose of anesthetic. One night, I briefly woke with only my dad in the room and started to panic. I frantically pulled at wires and tubes as if I were Neo in the Matrix. They had to hold me down, which was easy since I weighed about 120 pounds, and sedate me. When I woke up for good a few days later, I didn't remember any of it. I've since fully recovered, but the experience still scars my dad and family more than it ever affected me, to be honest. When I finally returned to school, it was my birthday a few weeks later, and a girl I barely knew said, "Happy birthday. I didn't think you would make it to this one." Dark joke too soon. Honestly, it was a pretty good way to get clout in high school, but overall 2 out of 10, I wouldn't recommend it. Story 41. It was not technically a coma. I was actually dead for a couple of minutes. I remember darkness all around me and feeling very cold. Then I regained consciousness in the back of an ambulance and thought what had just happened. I would not recommend dying, to be honest. Story 42. I was 9 years old. I fell headfirst 15 feet out of a treehouse. I blacked out for a second when I hit the ground. Apparently, I stuck like a lawn dart for a few seconds. When I opened my eyes, my grandfather was running toward me, but he was upside down. Things went black again as I felt my body falling over. I woke up looking down at my grandfather at my side. They put me in the car. This was 1980, and drove quickly to the emergency room. I watched my body from above in the back seat during the drive. At the emergency room, X-rays were negative. There were no computed tomography or magnetic resonance imaging scans available then, and I was sent to the intensive care unit. I spent the next 2 days watching from above, up in the corner of the intensive care unit room, looking down. I heard everything from my parents, grandparents, nurses, and doctors. I heard the doctors say there was swelling on the brain from the impact and that they did not know what the prognosis would be. Around the 2-day mark, I noticed things starting to fade to black. The next thing I knew, I was awake, and my parents were at the bedside crying over me. A nurse and a doctor came in and started checking me. I felt fine. I told them I had been there the whole time, looking down from the corner, but no one believed me. I began to quote, word for word, what had been said, and everyone was shocked. I stayed for 2 more days in a regular room for observation and was discharged home with no issues. In 2001, I had a computed tomography scan and a magnetic resonance imaging scan for a neck muscle tear and shoulder separation. I was told they could see old compression fractures of the cervical vertebrae C4, C5, and C6. Since the fall, I've always had a grinding sensation in my neck when turning my head from side to side, but no residual pain. Thank goodness for the flexibility of my young skeleton and, more importantly, a great deal of luck. During the entire event, I experienced no pain and was not frightened. I did not feel alone. There was no tunnel with a bright light at the end. I remember a presence with me the whole time. I did not see anyone, but I knew someone was there. No words were spoken, yet I felt calm and at peace. Story 43. I'm a bit late, but here goes. Back in October, I was diagnosed with stage 4 acute lymphoblastic leukemia, Burkitt's. During spinal surgery, the line delivering my sedatives collapsed, so I was not getting enough. I thought they should not be operating on me while I was awake, and I tried to get the nurse's attention. I lifted my head off the pillow and looked at the anesthesiologist, who had a horrifying look on her face. I panicked, and they knocked me out the hard way. I was told I was in a medically induced coma for 6 days. I was also told it took 12 doctors and nurses to hold me down when I fought them, which is impressive, since I had about 50% lung function and 70% bone marrow function at the time. It was a miracle I could walk around, let alone fight like a bull moose. That surgery was about 3 weeks into my hospital stay. I only remember the ambulance ride from the hospital that diagnosed me to the hospital that would treat me. I lost 3 weeks that are just random fragments. I had lucid dreams that were psychedelic and terrifying, because part of me knew it was not real and was desperate to wake up. When I finally did, I had vivid hallucinations. I was convinced I rode a blimp, had butterflies land in my eyes, and that a team of hitmen was trying to steal my medications. I hallucinated children playing in the room next to mine when there was no room next to mine. It was a window, and police lights would trick me. I was convinced there was a drop panel behind my bed leading to the sewer system, and that the hitmen were stealing my medications that way. I was also convinced the doctors had devices that made me fly. Mushrooms can't compare to comas. It took 2 weeks to relearn how to walk, and I was a fall hazard the whole time. My brain basically reverted to that of a 5-year-old in a 23-year-old man's body. It took about 6 weeks for my cognition to return to normal, I think, but the improvement was gradual. Being in a coma was the most unforgettable experience I can barely remember. I would not recommend it. Story 44. I was in a coma naturally for a day or so, then medically induced for about 6 weeks. There was nothing. No darkness, no dreams, no voices. I just woke up as if nothing had happened. I could tell that time had passed when I woke up, but I did not know how much. Waking up was surreal, like an existential waterslide with my body at the bottom. Story 45. I was in a coma for about a month. The month passed very quickly, almost like half a second. The strange part is that my family and friends came to visit and talk to me while I was in the coma. I remember what they said, but I do not know when they said it. Story 46. I was in a medically induced coma last year after a cardiac arrest. I remember nothing from the day it happened until I woke up. It feels like I existed, then vanished, and then existed again. Going from sitting at my desk to waking in a hospital bed and learning a week of your life has passed is surreal. I wish I could say I remembered what my loved ones said while I was asleep, but I do not. The only memory is opening my eyes and hearing my mother say, "Cinnamon bun, your heart stopped, but you are okay now." Story 47. I remember very vivid dreams and hearing snippets from movies and shows that intermixed with what was going on around me, turning into altered reality nightmares, followed by long periods of nothingness. After hitting a semi head-on at 60 miles per hour and severely injuring most of my body, the nothingness was much better than the pain upon waking. It was the most excruciating pain I have ever experienced, and I still have post-traumatic stress disorder from it. I was awake after the accident for the hour it took to cut me out, screaming the whole time. A flight medic arrived and gave me versed. After that, I remember being asked if I wanted to be put into a medically induced coma. I kept screaming and crying, "Make the pain stop. I don't care, just make it stop." They asked my husband. He asked me again and I repeated the same. I heard him say, "Do it." Then sweet blackness and bizarre nightmares for a week. Injuries included a femur fractured in half, repaired with an intramedullary rod and 4 screws. A clavicle fractured in half and separated by 6 inches, repaired with a plate and 7 screws. Fractures of most bones in my left hand with tears to most ligaments and tendons. A hand specialist repaired it over multiple hours because it is my dominant hand. I still have 2 screws remaining and 2 were removed. I cannot fully straighten my pinky and a bone fragment protrudes on the back of my hand. My right foot was nearly amputated at the ankle with a severe open compound fracture and significant nerve and vessel damage. Most hospitals in the state said amputation was the only option because the injury was too severe. One surgeon said he would try 12 hours after the accident, and the repair required frequent traction to restore pulses, which was severely painful. I still have 4 screws and worsening nerve pain, but I have my foot thanks to Dr. Hakios. I also had pulmonary contusions and cardiac contusions, a lacerated liver in multiple spots requiring several transfusions, a concussion, and a pressure wound on the back of my head from prolonged cervical collar use. It took a year to return to work and longer to recover emotionally and psychologically. I had a 20% chance of surviving. It was one of many times I beat the odds, and I became a much better nurse because of the experience. Thanks for listening. Story 48. I was in the hospital for 3 weeks after a brain aneurysm ruptured. I do not remember anything from that time, I remember waking up in rehabilitation confused and weak. I atrophied so badly. I am 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed about 150 pounds when I woke up. I now weigh about 210 pounds. I also grew 2 inches. All in all, I would not recommend it if you can avoid it, but it is better than being an organ donor. I do not mean to disparage organ donors. My family has explicit instructions for me to donate anything they can use, either to help people or for science. I am grateful to be able to use my body for a while longer. Story 49. I was in a coma for 2 hours after a car accident. For what felt like a few seconds, there were just flashes, then blackness, and then I woke up. Story 50. I was injured in Iraq in 2010. I was in a medically induced coma for about a week and flatlined 4 times. I was not very aware of the outside world and experienced significant pain. I am highly resistant to pain medications, sedatives, and stimulants due to a genetic mutation. So receiving 1,000 micrograms of fentanyl for an hour-long operation was not unusual. This does not include ketamine and hydromorphone. Ketamine was delivered via a pain pump into my spinal cord. I experienced a completely different reality that week. I heard conversations, felt certain sensations, and occasionally opened my eyes. This was because propofol and other sedatives meant to keep you asleep were mostly effective. However, I would sometimes wake up and become combative with the nurses at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center and Brooke Army Medical Center. I have had trouble separating my comatose experiences from reality, especially during the first 3 months after my injuries. I was prescribed many medications. I still experience this to some extent, but nowhere near the level I did while hospitalized. Story 51. Warning. Long post. I was in an induced coma for about 10 days after a very serious car accident. Amazingly, I did not have a head injury, although a 90 miles per hour, almost instant stop could have caused a small brain injury that was not initially detected. My internal injuries and a 4-hour emergency surgery meant it was better that I did not breathe on my own, because my lungs and diaphragm were not moving effectively. We were driving in torrential rain. The driver was easily going 50 miles per hour in a 30 miles per hour area. I was telling him to slow down and we aquaplaned after going over a small bump into an oncoming car. That driver was drunk and speeding too. Our car spun toward the passenger side, so I was hit first. This was the late 1990s, before the current European safety standards were introduced. Our car was like a biscuit tin. The other car was like a tank. It took over an hour to cut me out of the wreckage. I also smashed my pelvis, breaking it in 4 places. The usual surgical correction could not be done at the time because of other injuries. I broke my left superior and inferior pubic ramus, which malunited and means I cannot hold anything between my legs and have a weak pubic symphysis after dislocation. The left acetabulum and left sacral ala were also fractured. Now one leg is about 2 inches longer than the other. I broke multiple ribs on the left side, including a flail segment, and had a hemopneumothorax on the left, a punctured lung with the lung space filled with blood, preventing the lung from expanding. I also had a 5-inch perforation in my diaphragm through which part of my small intestine, large intestine, and stomach had herniated. The journey from the car to hospital was bizarre. I remember everything about the accident, being in the car vomiting blood and barely able to breathe. The force had pushed my side of the car under the driver's seat, with him still in it, so waiting for him to be hoisted off first was not fun. I remember telling the paramedics my home telephone number, address, my mother's mobile number, my father's mobile number, and my national insurance number. I think the drugs had started to work, although I was still in astonishing pain. The paramedics seemed confused as to why I was struggling to breathe on oxygen. Even with a punctured lung, they expected me to be better. I was using my stomach muscles instead of my damaged diaphragm to breathe, and because I was talking they thought I had just punctured a lung and broken both legs. I could feel pain but could not move them for weeks. At the hospital they gave me a computed tomography scan 3 hours after I arrived to assess the internal damage, after an emergency ultrasound that had been difficult to interpret because gas blocks ultrasound imaging. The presence of gas from my bowel in my chest was the clue. 3 hours after reinflating my lung, I crashed on the CT scanner and went for emergency surgery. I later met the doctor who had raced to the hospital blood bank that night to get me more blood. I had lost over a body's worth of blood. They told my parents I had roughly a 20% chance of surviving the surgery. After the surgery, they told my parents it was worse than anyone had initially realized and reiterated that the chance was about 20%. Never try to be the tough guy and pretend you are all right when seeking medical advice. That almost cost me my life. Because of the internal damage and flail ribs, they put me on a ventilator. I remember having a chest drain and still feeling terrible. I remember being sedated and a doctor checking my anal tone to assess spinal function. I remember being on the CT scanner and joking, "Is this the one people on TV are scared of?" It was not. That is magnetic resonance imaging, which is a very enclosed tube compared to computed tomography, which is like an open bed sliding through a ring. When I came around after the operation, I should have been fully sedated. In hospitals, being sedated and on ventilation does not mean you are given only opioid drugs such as fentanyl, remifentanil, and morphine. When in an induced coma for surgery, the drugs used are the paralytics and anesthetic agents used to put you to sleep, such as rocuronium, atracurium, and cisatracurium. It is not the same as taking a sedative at home. I should have been fully asleep for the first few days. I always joked with friends that I would take the longest to come up if we had anything illicit, and I felt I definitely was not given enough of the drugs. I had played a lot of rugby and sprinted and was largely muscle. Right after surgery, I could feel what felt like a zipper across my chest and stomach. I had 36 external staples after a laparotomy. My eyes were taped shut because when very tired or drunk, I sometimes sleep with my eyes partly open. Worst of all, I had a tube in my throat and, in my stupor, convinced myself it was turned off. In movies, when people are ventilated, you see their chest rise and fall. With broken ribs and a torn diaphragm, that movement was limited. I was ventilated with a constant circulation of oxygen in my lungs, but if you have ever held your breath for a long time, your body still reflexively tries to breathe. My muscles were relaxed enough that I was not gagging, but being unable to take a breath started to panic me. I could hear nurses and tapped the bed rail to get their attention. I tried to communicate that I could not breathe. They kept saying, "It's all right," without explaining why, and tried to hold my hand away from the ventilator. I used to arm wrestle and was a very strong 18-year-old, so I grabbed the device. I remember the cacophony as staff tried to hold my right arm down. I thought I was done for. I had survived so much in the hours since the crash, and now I feared this would be the point of failure. I remember thinking, perhaps irrationally, about Harry Houdini and the supposed record for breath holding. I decided I would count to 300, and if I was still alive then, maybe the team knew what they were doing. I probably counted around 10 times. When I reached 300, I was exhausted and confused and accepted that there was nothing more I could do. The fight was over. I pulled out my nasogastric tube and was fairly combative during the rest of my time in intensive care. After an eternity of confusion and struggle, they finally removed my endotracheal tube. I was relieved that my vomit looked like green pesto and not blood. There had been a lot of vomiting blood. I was asked what year I thought it was. I had no idea, so they told me to think of the most recent year I could remember. I said 1991 or 1992, and they told me bluntly it was 1996. I was very confused until my parents came and explained everything. The drugs have an amnestic property, so I regained memory of events over the next couple of days, but being told the year by the nurse directly helped kickstart my brain. After all that, I put on a lot of weight, never skateboard again, never played rugby again, and cannot have my pelvis fixed without extensive reconstructive surgery, which carries a significant risk of impotence. I was allowed home after 6 weeks, barely able to walk and using a Zimmer frame. My mother was at home to look after me. The first night home, despite a lot of pain, my girlfriend and I had sex and I found that my genital function was intact. I was not willing to risk that with reconstructive surgery. I can walk fine now and can run if I need to. Walking is mostly without pain, but I stopped physiotherapy after badly popping the cartilage in my left rib while using the bed rails to sit myself up. In hindsight, I should not have been allowed to do that, but the broken ribs were painful and I wanted some movement. I still walk a little bit oddly. There have been no lasting issues with my internal organs or lungs so far. I am 42 now. Summary: big crash, major surgery, long recovery, and painful sex. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.